All right, so I'm going to start this presentation and come back for some of the conclusions, thinking about gendered knowledge and uncertainty in central Queensland and what we are experimenting with calling affective inference. This presentation partly is a response to a recent publication which Michael Westway also drew attention to yesterday in the journal Archaeology in Oceania, which analyses a place called Gai Nani Bura, or Women's Sacred Place, that was identified during cultural heritage surveys for the North Galilee Basin Rail Project in the Jangga Peoples Determined Area in central Queensland. And in that case, which was also published in The Conversation, researchers undertook excavations, artefact analysis and OSL dating, alongside consultations with contemporary Jangga people, with the information about the location's gendered association said to reside primarily with a named elder who shared knowledge passed down to her from her grandmother. But in addition to those data, Jangga people reported affective experiences around this place, with women reporting strong feelings of peace and belonging. And the paper also reports ambiguously that male construction workers told Jangga people about a number of female spirit sightings, including a young woman in traditional clothing with a baby. We're not told whether they were Indigenous or non-Indigenous male construction workers, but assuming that they weren't Jangga people. So, based on these data, the researchers conclude that the site was traditionally used by Jangga women and forbidden to men, expressing gendered domains of cultural practice and knowledge, that artefacts collected at the place include stone tools used in birthing practices, everyday production and ochre decoration. They conclude that the discovery of an unfinished axe blank, amongst other lithics, complicates gendered assumptions about tool making, as, quote, these finds suggest that Aboriginal women manufactured and used lithic items for a diverse range of activities. And further, there is, quote, a seamless connection between the living memory and the dated sedimentary sequence. Therefore, the continuity of the Jangga cultural tradition in this area can be firmly traced back from at least 500 years to the present day, with the potential to extend it further to 7,000 years once more archaeological evidence becomes available. So, what is being assumed in these conclusions? Well, to begin with, the article appropriately critiques androcentrism in archaeology and anthropology. It foregrounds Jangga women's interpretations of the archaeology, and it argues for the use of archaeology to support the protection of Indigenous heritage. It also emphasises its results as preliminary and uncertain. However, the article seems to assume, firstly, that archaeological evidence confirms gendered toolmaking, yet it seems to us that archaeology only confirms activity at that location, and that archaeology actually tells us little about gendered production in the deep past. It further assumes that continuity of occupation and toolmaking over 7,000 years confirms continuity of meaning. Yet archaeological data does not, and it seems cannot, demonstrate that ritual, social or symbolic meanings at the site from 7,000 years ago bear resemblance to those recorded today. And thirdly, contemporary feelings of peace, presence and ancestral connections confirm deep time activity, that affect fills the evidentiary gap that the archaeologists encounter in seeking to bridge contemporary interpretations with deep time meanings. But affect is not evidence of past function. So I think this article is interesting, not because it's an outlier, because I'm not sure that it really is anymore, but it seems to me exemplary of an analytical style which is prevalent in recognition or late recognition It rightly notes that problems facing the protection of Aboriginal women's sacred sites in particular have included a lack of understanding of Aboriginal cultures, ontologies and epistemologies, racism, sexism and misogyny. And in making that rightful finding, it assumes or it contends that archaeological research processes can repair historical injustice by scientifically validating partial and contingent knowledge as authoritative and true. So as a result, the epistemic problems that the analysis generates don't surface in that interpretation, because the political framing renders any questioning of its interpretation of women's sites as another instance of misrepresentation. But of course, within the native title perspective, these epistemic problems are very prominent, and I think beyond native title, they're analytically interesting for what they disclose to us about uncertainty, especially in relation to gendered knowledge and affective inference and its retrojection into the past, and in this case, the deep past, is governed, or how it's contained or how it's structured and interpreted in contemporary recognition. And I guess importantly, nothing that we're saying here relies on or offers any perspective on the conclusion that this is or isn't a women's site. We're not seeking to trouble that finding. But what we're pointing to is not a failure of archaeology, but a problem of late recognition and a struggle to govern uncertainty, it seems. And in this case, as I've already indicated, affective inference functions to fill the gap. The mine acceded to the request to reroute its railway line. The Guidana Bureau became a women's site on the Queensland Cultural Heritage Register, and these findings entered the public record. So it fills the evidentiary gap, and it becomes registered as a women's place in Queensland. But it's easy enough to point to what I consider to be the flawed assumptions underpinning this article. But what I thought is more interesting and productive analytically is to start to think through affect anthropologically as a mode of apperception in settings like central Queensland, where people in many instances have been dislocated from their country and have come to encounter it fulsomely in the participation in, for example, Aboriginal cultural heritage surveys as an important instrument where people get back out on country and experience these kinds of emotions and feelings and perceptions that we're describing as affect, and then interpret them. So we're thinking through the question of what kinds of findings affect can legitimately support, and firstly what we know from our research, myself and Kim, not with Jangga people, I haven't worked with Jangga people, but in the broader region. My work with Western Gungalu people, and Kim will talk to Gungalu Nation people. And secondly, how does this kind of affective inference fit within native title, and what evidentiary and other constraints is it likely to encounter outside the kind of cultural heritage context which produced its registration as a women's site in the federal court where we do our work. So now I will pass over to my colleague.
Thank you, Richard. So I'm going to provide you with some illustrative material. I've worked in the region for about 20 years, I guess, and we both, Richard and I, have been struck by the prevalence of references to gender during fieldwork in this region when talking about relations to land. And that, of course, has partly prompted this presentation alongside the publication Richard referred to. So I'm going to take you to some illustrative quotes, really, to show you how people speak about places and so on in the field. And I've highlighted some of the key phrases in bold here, but they might speak about a mountain that is a physical and spiritual place that only initiated men can go to. It's a strong spiritual place. If you go there, you can get sick or have bad luck. These are pretty, common references to what I considered important places. And somebody spoke to me about, his father taking him to that particular area, showed him some places, pointed to a Bohrer ring. There's some literature around Bohrer rings, if you're not familiar with that phrase in Queensland. And it's said to be used for the initiation of men. At another place, he pointed out a women's site and told them to never go there. There is also what that man refers to as an axe factory, an old quarry, right, at the top of the range, and this was a men's site. He was told not to go to the places where there were janjari, a little hairy man, commonly in local belief, because it was either a bad site, or a men's site, or a women's site. Another man referred to a place in this way. There's a woman's site there near that hill, and my father said, never ever go there. That's a woman's site. We were forbidden to go there as young men, and I've always told my children and other young men, the man talking to me said, that it was a taboo site. It was a woman's site, and I got a feeling that it was also to do with birthing. So it was a birthing site also. And that's an important conclusion, of course, reached by this man. Another man spoke in this way. The first time my older sister went down to this particular lake we were at, she went chicken. She had this feeling, it sort of wasn't a really good place. Or this particular woman talking about a place. I suppose you don't listen properly to your elders when I was young. So we went out there, and I soon quickly left because you can just feel it. I can just feel it in myself that it was very uneasy. I wouldn't get out of the car. It was just so uneasy. Again, a particular man speaking about a Bohrer ring. It can make you sick, might get sick. You may get lost. For those of you who read the Povinelli article for today, might be something. This woman spoke about men's business. It's men's business. It's not something that I should listen to. Yes, there are special women's sites, but especially on the tablelands, I'm not 100% certain, like where they are located, though. Okay, and finally, a somewhat lengthy quote that I nevertheless wanted to put up here. A man speaking about where his dad took him. And we always used to know about this mountain. I said to Dad, can you take me down there? He said, yeah, but we've got to be careful because it's a woman's site. And we were very wary. By that time, I was very wary of what it meant from a difference between a woman's site and a man's site. So I went down there, just got as far as the car park, and I couldn't go any further. Those old spirits there, they just held me in that car. No, seriously, they just made me sit in that car, and I got really wobbly and sick. I wouldn't get out. I said, Dad, I can't get out of here. He said, no, you're all right. Those old spirits are down here. They're just telling you not to be here. So in my lifetime, I've never been back down there. If I go down there, it will be just as close as that parking area, because not only because of what they mean, but I do respect the difference between a woman's site and a men's site. And I impress that on my younger generations. But when you walk this land, you just don't run around, being a hooligan. You've got to take care of where you walk, because this is your great-great-grandfather's land, and he's still here in this land to protect this land, but through you. So if you do anything wrong, he's the first one there to jump on you. Okay, so those are some illustrative quotes indicating the ways in which people speak about gender in this particular setting. The ethnographic record for this particular region is very limited indeed. There's very few direct references to gendered knowledge. There's severe population loss and removal from country historically. The knowledge of ceremonial life and associated sites is very limited. And there's no relevant ethnographic data about ceremonial locations. However, based on the broader literature, we can assume male and female ritual knowledge and practices existed, including certain restrictions, right? Rich contemporary data, however, often emphasizes a radical separation of gender categories. Today, gendered sites are inferred based on feelings, emotions, perceptions, etc., right? The affect we speak about. Identification is often uncertain and sometimes provisional, but subject to precautionary avoidance of places due to perceptions of danger. So, in starting the conclusions, we might say the following, perhaps provisionally at least. Affective inference is not, of course, a substitute for evidence. It can't close the evidentiary gap Richard talked about earlier to the deep past. Neither is inference necessarily an illustration of disruption, loss, or fabrication, etc. In central Queensland, affective responses to place might illustrate how relations with country are lived and felt in the present, not the past. Affect discloses ongoing obligations, or it might do so, and relations with country. However, affective inferences are susceptible, of course, to evidentiary challenges and must be properly explained. There might be inconsistencies in the oral evidence about such places when it goes to trial, for example. Today, gendered sites are associated with potential danger arising from spiritual presence in the country and potential breaches of rules based on assumptions about past restrictions at gendered places. Uncertainty fuels unease and avoidance behavior. Richard might take us to some further conclusions.
Well, just three more points. It seems to me that affect is becoming more prominent, actually, as other forms of knowledge become less available or less publicly articulable. So it's becoming more of a phenomenon to be explained. And you know, there is this question in our minds about the striking relevance of gender in settings like this, which seems to reflect both adapted traditions. I mean, there's such rich data about law and custom in the quotations that Kim displayed. But the question in our mind is also about the relations with the broader society and assumptions about gender and the separation of genders and so forth that seem to, also reflect the intercultural relations and the context and the setting of cultural heritage surveys, for example. So just the last point, the sort of the obvious point, and it does take us somewhat outside the native title inquiry, but returning to our thoughts about the article, the problem that we've identified is not that affective interest is being asked to do too much work, but it's being asked to do the wrong kind of work. And I think we can see in those quotations that affective inference, if that is an appropriate term, does tell us a lot about contemporary law and custom and spiritual relations with the landscape and the contemporary manifestations of social categories and relations with country and so forth. But we'd caution against its romanticisation as a radical epistemology that fills that evidentiary gap to the deep past. Thanks.